Hello, welcome back to Life on the Franch. Today we are talking about a somewhat distressing topic. We're going to be talking about a serial killer, specifically named Nielsen, who murdered up to 16 people and attempted to kill about 7 more. We're going to briefly be talking about his crimes, but we're also going to be talking about the way that homophobia impeded the investigation into those crimes, as well as how serial killers in general prey off of vulnerable groups. And so we're going to transition into talking about LGBTQ plus youth homelessness, which remains a huge problem here in the United States and elsewhere. First, I learned about this serial killer through a Netflix docuseries or documentary called Memories of a Murderer, the Nielsen tapes. And what I disliked, I guess, about the documentary was how much it downplayed the ineptitude of the police department in this investigation, and how many mischances there were because of the rampant homophobia at the time. Nielsen is believed to have murdered up to 16 vulnerable young men, many of whom were gay, in North London between 1978 and 1983. And he attempted to kill several others. It was said at the time that some were homeless, runaways, or sex workers. Others were gay or straight youths lured to Nielsen's house with promises of a meal, drink, or sex. In 1978, Stephen Dean Holmes, age 14, was last seen on his way home from a rock concert. He accepted an offer to drink alcohol with Nielsen at his apartment at Melrose Avenue. And the following morning, Nielsen strangled Holmes with a necktie until he was unconscious before drowning him in a bucket of water. Then his body was to remain beneath Nielsen's floorboards for over 7 months before being disposed of in a bonfire. And he's the only victim to not have been dissected before disposal. And investigators announced his identification in November of 2006. Then we have our next victim, Kenneth James Okudin, who is age 23 and was a Canadian student on a tour of the UK. And he was one of the few murder victims who was widely reported as a missing person. Most of the victims that Nielsen chose were never reported missing. And that's because many of them were in London, sort of estranged from their families. Many of the victims were gay, but not all. So in total, Nielsen was convicted for killing 6 victims and 2 attempted murders. He was originally sentenced to 25 years in prison, but that was later extended. And not all of his victims have been identified. Nielsen named very few victims by name. Instead, he would recall in graphic detail the way that they were murdered and the way that he interacted with the body after they had died. He had several rituals. And since this isn't a true crime video, I'm not going to go into the details here because my larger point is it led me down this rabbit hole of homophobia in the police department and the way that that impacted this case. And also the way that having LGBTQ plus youth at such a large risk of homelessness puts them in a category that makes them extremely vulnerable to serial killers, but also to muggings, sexual assault, and other trauma. So we're going to be looking at those data points instead, and what can we do as a society to help LGBTQ plus youth homeless people. So the mishandling of the Dennis Nielsen investigation was really revealed in a 3-part BBC documentary, and it told the story from the viewpoints of the victims. So this is a very different approach than the Netflix documentary. The Netflix documentary focused more on the voice and the tape recordings of Nielsen, and most of the interviews were with the investigators, and you only saw a couple interviews with survivors and with a couple family members, but it was largely just a story of how it was solved, and I felt that if you're going to do a documentary, you need to investigate and question all the people involved, and I felt like they went really easily on the police officers in this case. The BBC documentary was directed by gay filmmaker Michael Ogden, and the Nielsen Files is an attempt to understand how as many as 16 young men could disappear from the nation's capital without anybody noticing. And it showed that prejudice clouded police investigations from the get-go, as well as the way that the media portrayed the victims in such an unflattering light, by calling them male prostitutes, drifters of no fixed abode. And as one interviewee put it, quote, "We were trash, the lowest of the low," unquote. And some of the press coverage even blamed the victims or insinuated that they were partially to blame for their own deaths. But we'll never know for sure how many of his victims were gay or sex workers. But once they were described as such by Nielsen, police, media, and the public sympathy diminished. In an article by The Guardian, which I'll be linking all of my articles that I've been using down below, the police seemed more interested in prosecuting gay men than in protecting them. In 1967, police harassment increased and gay arrests rocketed to more than 1,000 a year during the years 1970s and 1980s. And from 1986 to 1991, this reporter identified in their own research that 50 murders where evidence pointed to a homophobic motive. So there are a couple of reasons why we can see the police zone prejudice impacted this case. So the first is, so in 1978, Nielsen tried to kill Andrew Ho. Ho escaped and reported the attack to the police. He was nervous and decided not to protect charges. He was an immigrant, and at 19, he was under the then lawful gay age of consent, which is apparently different from the legal age of consent for straight people, of 21. And he could have faced 2 years in jail if he admitted to engaging in any sexual acts with Nielsen. So, but had they done a proper investigation and caught Nielsen, it's possible that 15 victims may still be alive. Another survivor was Douglas Stewart, who fought off a strangulation attempt by Nielsen in November 1980. But the police dismissed this as a alcohol-fused lover's quarrel. Stewart later said, quote, "As soon as the word homosexual was mentioned, the police lost all interest," end quote. And if the police had gone into Nielsen's flat in response to Ho and Stewart's reports, they may have discovered bodies hidden under the floorboards, as well as traces of dissected corpses in his garden shed where he burned the body parts. Unfortunately, Nielsen went on to kill 4 more years. In May 1982, Carl Suter was attacked by Nielsen and also lived to tell the tale. Again, the police did nothing. And at Nielsen's trial, 19-year-old Paul Nobbs testified that despite escaping a murder attempt, he never went to the police. Prevailing homophobia silenced him. He was under 21 and not out as gay to his family. And if you just listen to all these stories about, there are 7 people who lived to tell the tale of this evil person attempting to murder them, and some were so afraid that they wouldn't even go to the police because they knew what the response would be, and the ones who were brave enough to go to the police basically were proved right, that the police didn't care, that they themselves were going to be potentially prosecuted, and they weren't going to be taken seriously because of their sexual orientation, or rather the sexual orientation of the killer. It's just upsetting, and I really feel like the Netflix documentary did not drive this point home hard enough, because the police had so many opportunities to catch this killer and to save lives, and they didn't because they were blinded by prejudice and blinded by the confines of homophobic laws. It's just really upsetting. And since we know that at this time, society was much more homophobic and families were much more likely to, abandon or exile gay family members from themselves, it's unsurprising that Nielsen found so many victims that were never reported missing, that, were part of, the LGBTQ plus community. And again, we don't know how many there were. We know that some of them were straight, but we know some of them were not. And it just got me thinking about, especially some of the ages of these victims. So I started digging down the rabbit hole of LGBTQ plus homeless youth, and I thought this would be an interesting segue to see what is it like here in the United States today, and what can we be doing. So we're going to be jumping into that now. So we know that serial killers, serial rapists, serial offenders who get away with it the longest target the most vulnerable populations. And one of the most vulnerable populations in the United States and around the world is LGBTQ youth. And that's because LGBTQ youth are at a greater risk of homelessness. They are 2.2 times the risk of reporting homelessness than their straight counterparts. We can break down that statistic even further. So this is the explicit homelessness over the last 12 months, self-reported by young adults aged 18 to 25. And these estimates do not include reports of couch surfing only. So this is like on the streets homelessness or in shelters. This is not like staying at a friend's house homelessness. So we have 4% white non-LGBTQ, 7% black non-LGBTQ, compared to 8% white and LGBTQ, and 16% black LGBTQ. So we can see that among the white population, the number doubles. Among the black population, the number doubles. And overall, we see that in both instances, it is twice the rate of their non-LGBTQ peers. Intersectionality plays a huge role. We'll talk about later how coming out and being kicked out is kind of an oversimplification of many of the experiences of homeless LGBTQ plus youth. But it's important to note this intersectionality because it affects where we should be putting in shelters and how we should think of this population and how to address the multiple confounding variables that they're experiencing in terms of stigmatization, ostracization, and homophobia and racism. So LGBTQ youth experience high levels of adversity, including early death. In fact, this study found that LGBTQ youth have over twice the rate of early death among youth experiencing homelessness. And similarly, while virtually all youth facing homelessness experience adversity, LGBTQ youth describe particularly pervasive exposure to trauma both before and during their periods of homelessness. I think this figure is very telling, also very harrowing. It highlights the differences between LGBTQ youth homeless and non-LGBTQ homeless. So you can see that while 9% of non-LGBTQ homeless exchange sex for basic needs, that rate triples to 27% for LGBTQ youth. In terms of being forced to have sex or sexual assault, let's call it what it is, 38% of LGBTQ homeless youth experienced that compared to 15% of non-LGBTQ youth. Obviously, both numbers are high, but that is a very large distinction. And part of the reason that we're seeing these higher levels of these higher rates is because, as we'll see, LGBTQ youth often face stigmatizations at shelters and therefore turn to the streets and then are at higher risk of sexual exploitation in order to gain access to basic needs. So basically they are either kicked out of shelters or they're harassed out of shelters, put back onto the street, and then end up with higher rates of danger in all areas. 62% of LGBTQ youth are physically harmed by others compared to 47%, and 25% self-harmed versus 15%. And that statistic we also see with non-homeless LGBTQ youth having higher rates of mental illnesses, and we see that here reflected on the streets as well. In terms of exposed to discrimination or stigma within the family, we have 64% of LGBTQ youth versus 37%. And this indicates that probably them being LGBTQ is a large reason of why they are homeless. But as we'll discuss again later, there is a lot of intersectionality at play, including poverty, instability in the home. There are a lot of factors that can be implicated in why youth are homeless, and being LGBTQ is only one. But as we can see, the discrepancies here, it is a factor, and it certainly affects them once they are out on the street. And then we see that not only are they discriminated against within their family, we also see that 60% of LGBTQ homeless are exposed to discrimination or stigma outside of the family, compared to 37% of non-LGBTQ youth. And this could mean that they're getting less sympathy and less kindness from strangers who could help them than non-LGBTQ youth, which puts them in at a cycle of not being able to get help, not being able to get out of that situation, and not be given opportunities to get out of that situation because of external discrimination. And as I've been mentioning, homelessness stems from multiple factors beyond coming out. Common notions of LGBTQ youth being immediately evicted by families when they come out, it's overly simplistic and obscures important opportunities for family-based intervention. This isn't to say that sometimes a person comes out and then immediately is evicted. that does happen, but a lot of the times we see that there's a gradual escalation of the parent-child conflict over time and a growing sense of rejection in the home. And then that is what caused homelessness. And that means that there's this implication of more opportunity and more time to intervene with LGBTQ youth and their families to prevent difficult situations from devolving into homelessness. Typically, the young person's sexual orientation or gender identity is only one factor involved in household tensions. Most families also faced issues of instability, including poverty, loss, violence, addiction, mental health problems, or housing troubles. And these dynamics preceded or coincided with the youth's identity or coming out process. So we need to look at this holistically in terms of preventing LGBTQ homelessness. We also need to look at, these as where we should place things. Is this happening everywhere, or is it more likely to happen in poverty-stricken neighborhoods than not? It seems that it is. But again, we also need to focus on what LGBTQ homeless people need, because they do have different needs and they have different risk factors than their non-LGBTQ peers. Finally, as I said, it's important for LGBTQ youth to find safe, affirming responses and services. This could involve finding a program that has LGBTQ adults working as role models, or Big Brother programs, or creating a network that allows the LGBTQ youth to feel less like an other and feel supported and validated in themselves. Whether if you're talking about gender and transitioning, access to that kind of health care is going to be important. These are factors that need to be considered when creating a solution for LGBTQ homelessness. One statistic that I found to be very moving and striking was that 40% of New York City homeless youth are LGBTQ+. 40%. If we compare that to the percent of LGBTQ+ youth in the general population, that's staggering. We're looking at what's approximated to be about 2% of the population having 40%, accounting for 40% of the homeless youth population. It shouldn't be that way. And we definitely need to find a way to address this, both, so to prevent it from happening, and for when it happens, how we deal with it. There are a couple of ways, a couple steps that can be taken. For example, analyzing how staff are screened before being hired, providing professional development to current staff, including enhanced training to identify and respond to trauma experienced by the LGBTQ population, engaging the LGBTQ+ youth as full partners in strengthening and improving systems and services, locating LGBT-sensitive outreach services and housing options in near or predominantly Black and multiracial communities equitably, again, referring to that intersectionality that we see at play in these situations, and developing partnerships with the LGBTQ+ community to connect youth with adult LGBTQ+ role models. And most importantly, it's important that for runaway and homeless youth services, they should follow a positive youth development and trauma-informed approach in providing care and supports. So to conclude, I realize this was a very heavy topic, starting with serial killer, ending with LGBTQ youth homelessness, but I think it's very important that we highlight these issues and we highlight these vulnerable populations, especially when we see, programs like on Netflix do an inadequate job of highlighting the problems that persist and the vulnerable populations that we continue to ignore. in their docuseries and failing to point out the mishandling of the case. And I'm glad that the BBC ran a docuseries that did that and did highlight the discrepancy. But the fact that the Netflix documentary, which was an hour and a half long, didn't put that out nearly enough was just greatly unsettling. And I thought this would be an opportunity to talk about an ongoing issue using the public's fascination with serial killers. So, you know, it's a problem bigger than any one person, but I think that the more people that care about this issue and the more people that pay attention to this issue, the more that can be done on this issue, and the more people will start to become advocates for this vulnerable population. So I just want to say that if you, no matter who you are, no matter how you identify, you are valid, and you are cared about, you are seen, and you are loved. If you want to see more of our LGBTQ plus playlist, I'll leave it over here. If you want to see more of our content, click the bell button over here. Most importantly, though, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.